Out of a small island nation came a man driven by ruthless ambition. At his zenith, he would rule over 70 million people and transform the face of Europe. Warrior, emperor, despot, he rode the tiger of revolution to become one of the most admired and reviled men in history, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Hi everyone, as you probably guessed from the intro, we are talking about Napoleon today. Napoleon's an incredibly surprising person. He is one of the most written about people in history. There are actually more books written about Napoleon than there are days since he died. One of the most surprising things about Napoleon is that he wasn't French. He was actually born an Italian. He didn't speak French until he was 9 years old. He was born on the island of Corsica, which was an Italian possession until right after his birth, when a failed rebellion happened there. Napoleon's father was actually involved in, and then it became a possession of France shortly after that. Napoleon's family were minor nobles, but they were living in almost poverty. He was the fourth child out of 11. Some biographies you'll see 13 or 15 children in the Bonaparte family. He was originally known as Bonaparte, which the more Italian pronunciation of the name. Depending on how the historians counted children, some of his siblings died very young, so they're counted in. He was the fourth out of 11 children that reached adulthood. He said he was poor. They had to beg for a scholarship, and luckily got one to the Brienne military school, which was in mainland France. The fact that he had to beg for a scholarship and almost didn't get that opportunity is going to impact him later on in his life when he decides that he's going to be the first one, and one of the first ones in history, to advocate for a free public education for all French children. He didn't have many friends. He was small. He was also made fun of because of his strong Italian accent that he had when he went to the military school. He wasn't a very good academic student. He's going to finish towards the bottom of his class in academics, but he was very good at battle strategies. The place where he went to school at Brienne was pretty cutthroat. They would set the kids up against each other in different contests. One of their favorites was snowball battles, because they felt that it kind of mimicked war. And Napoleon really thought at the next level. He would stockpile snowballs, and while the other kids were just going out and trying to win with a stronger arm or throwing faster, he was stockpiling snowballs and building forts and defensive systems. And he was able to win these snowball battles even when the instructors put him on a side with inferior numbers. He graduated at 14. He went to the École Militaire, which was the preeminent military school in France. There he graduated in just a year. He was then on leave afterwards when some of the beginning events of the French Revolution happened. He finished as a second lieutenant in the artillery, which was kind of a nowhere position. If you wanted to be promoted, the people who were in the infantry or the cavalry were the ones that became the generals and the important military leaders. Napoleon, not a whole lot was expected of him as the second lieutenant in the artillery. He was in Corsica when the revolution broke out on leave, as I said. And that's fortunate because he didn't have to pick sides right away. He could see which way the wind was blowing in the revolution before he got involved. He was also not on another break when the attack on the Tuileries happened in 1791. At this time, he saw that the king could have defended himself. He had the high ground, he had soldiers, and we mentioned this in class before. And he really just thought the king's indecisiveness was what lost the battle there for him, or it lost him his freedom. So he decided at that moment that he was always going to try to be the aggressor in a battle. He also almost got crushed by the crowd, and it made him have a fear of crowds for the rest of his life. first place where Napoleon became a national figure in France and where he's really made a name for himself was at the Siege of Toulon. Toulon was in southern France, and it was under siege by the British at the sea, and it was under siege on land by a group of counter-revolutionaries. And so the British were trying to help them. Napoleon goes in and realizes when the previous artillery commander fell ill, and Napoleon was recommended by Robespierre's brother. So he had friends in high places. Napoleon went in and saw that the equipment was in disarray, the strategy was wrong, and he is going to train the men. He's going to relocate the artillery up overlooking the harbor, and he's going to invent something called hot shot, which are superheated cannonballs, which were able to ignite the ships and the gunpowder on them, and he's able to break the siege in 3 months. So this brings him some fame and certainly prestige, and it's going to move him up the military ladder pretty quickly. So they figure he's a miracle worker. He can break the siege in Toulon. He can take over for the counter-revolutionary activity in the Vendée, is what they ask him to do. The Vendée was the place where most of the violence of the counter-revolution happened. You can see all the deaths over by the Loire River. 2,000 people were drowned in there. There were 3,000 people executed. It was the hotbed of the counter-revolutionaries. Napoleon refuses to go. He sees this as a no-win situation. And when he refuses to go, he's put on the inactive list, which is fortunate for him again, because around this time, the revolution falls apart for Robespierre and the current leaders of the revolution. And Napoleon's actually arrested because of his ties to them. However, he gets another stroke of luck when a mob surrounds the National Convention, and they're looking for help. So what they do is they know that Napoleon has seen these kind of situations. They know that he's ruthless, and they let him out of prison if he promises to help, and he does. He gets his artillery, and he loads it up with grape shot. Grape shot is, if you know how a shotgun works, like a shotgun shell, there's all the BBs in it, and they spread out in a wide area. Well, grape shot is like a canister that's put in a cannon, and the BBs in that are about as big as grapes. So it shoots a wide area of death and destruction. And Napoleon fired grape shot into the crowd, killed between 50 and 150 people, and saves the assembly. And now he's kind of a public hero for what he did at Toulon, and now he's a hero to the convention and feels that they owe him for saving them. So he's finally given an army. He's given the army of Italy as a general after this. And he's really used as a decoy. He's supposed to go into the southern part of France, the northern Italy, and draw the troops away from the northern part, the Austrian troops that are still in the war, this war with Austria that was started back in still under King Louis. It's his first time commanding an army. Nothing's really expected of him other than to maybe draw some troops away while the experienced generals come in and then capture Vienna. The ploy doesn't work as well as the French intended, but it works. Napoleon wins battle after battle. All those red X's you see are Napoleon's victories in the Italian campaign. And meanwhile, the experienced generals that were supposed to march in through to Vienna were getting stalled in the north. And even as Napoleon pulled more and more troops away from that area. Napoleon wanted to make sure everybody knew about his victories and knew how famous he was. At every battle site, he would have a picture painted or a portrait painted of himself. He used propaganda, such as like newspaper articles. He would pretend to be a soldier in the battle, and he would talk about how Napoleon rushed here and there, and Napoleon seemed to be everywhere on the battlefield, talking about how brave Napoleon was. And here, these are actually written by his own hand, but they were sent back to Paris, and people were reading about this hero Napoleon. He also would send back art that he had stolen from Italy, some of the Renaissance treasures. One of the reasons there's so many Renaissance treasures in the Louvre are because of Napoleon's thefts of artwork throughout Italy. You also remember the thief who stole the Mona Lisa. He had talked about how Napoleon had stolen it from Italy. Not sure if Napoleon was the reason it was there, but it was just the reputation that he had for looting Italian artworks. Napoleon also was new for battle techniques. He had some ingenuitive techniques in the battlefield. I'm going to kind of fly through this. If you want to read about Napoleon's battle techniques, you can. There's plenty of books and videos on it. But one thing he always looked for was momentum. He was trying to make sure that he got the other side to take that first backward step. And once he got them going backwards, he was able to take them. He's going to change around the artillery. In previous wars, like when you went to Gettysburg last year, you saw that the artillery was behind the soldiers and up on the hill and used to fire long distance. Napoleon wanted to get it out there in front so he could use it to blast holes in the enemy lines and start that momentum, and then his men could fill in behind it. He also wanted to live off the land. If you didn't have a supply line, you didn't have to defend the supply line, your moves weren't predictable, so he taught his soldiers to live off the land. He used something called corps, which was a smaller, quicker group of soldiers. He would have his men organized into 4 corps, each one with a artillery, cavalry, and infantry. And the most powerful of them were the Imperial Guard, which were his most seasoned soldiers. They were very feared throughout Europe. When they came on the battlefield, whooping and hollering, they had coonskin caps, and the other side would oftentimes just flee the battlefield when they saw the Imperial Guard coming. He used these 3 different formations. The first one, you can see it's lots of men lined up in a row. This was used because it was a lot of firepower. You had a lot of guns facing the enemy. The third one was used when Napoleon wanted to charge. He would break through the enemy in columns and try and split them and separate them. He really liked this second one because you had the combination of the two. You would fire the guns in number 2 across, and the cannons would blow a hole in the enemy, and then the columns could then come through and break through that hole that they had busted with the artillery. And Napoleon's going to win battles all throughout Europe, and he's going to eventually conquer Austria and become a conquering hero. And when he gets home, he's going to be able to overthrow the Directory and become at first the consul of France. He's going to quickly increase his power until he becomes where he gets crowned as emperor. And this is in another painting by Jacques Louis David of Napoleon. Here he is crowning his wife Josephine. That day he angered the Pope and his mother and even Beethoven, because when the Pope went to crown Napoleon, he actually took the crown out of the Pope's hands and put it on his own head, basically saying that the Pope didn't have the right to crown him. He could crown himself, and then he turned and crowned his wife there as well. Beethoven had dedicated a symphony to Napoleon, and he took his name off of it. His mother didn't speak to him for a while because she was angered at how he had disrespected the Pope. Pretty soon, France was at war with just about all of Spain, or all of Europe. They had taken over Spain in a very bloody and brutal war, took over Austria, and the Austrian Empire was pretty huge at that point. They were allies with Russia and Sweden, or at least had an agreement with them, and he was only at war with Great Britain in 1810. He had thought of many ways to attack Great Britain, trying to dig a tunnel under there. Britain was still the champion of the seas. There were several battles. The Battle of Trafalgar was a particular battle where the British were able to defeat the French on the seas. And so Napoleon tried to set up something called the Continental System to keep the British from being able to trade and to try and hurt their economy that way. So you can see there was a bit of a hole in Portugal, for the Continental System, so it wasn't very effective overall, but it was an attempt of trying to starve out the British as an island nation. A little bit more. Again, Napoleon was constantly at war, shifting. This is in 1812. Things are still going well for him on the war front, except for, again, this constant rivalry he has with Great Britain and the Duke of Wellington, who was the leader of their military. Napoleon had an alliance with Tsar Alexander, who was the Tsar of Russia, who was Alexander V. And he had an alliance, at least a treaty with him, a peace treaty, and then it ended up breaking, and Napoleon decided that he was going to invade Russia. And this was a huge error on his part in 1812 when he decided to invade. As anyone who ever has invaded Russia knows, it's huge and has horrible winters. In the spring, the roads are almost impassable because they are incredibly muddy and swampy. So the Russians aren't going to fight Napoleon. They don't have the same kind of military advancements and tactics, but they decided to just retreat and use their land as their biggest asset. And when they retreated, they practiced something called the scorched earth policy. They would burn their crops. They would drive all the animals to the east, and those that they couldn't, they would kill. They would even poison their own wells so that the French troops couldn't live off their land. So what did Napoleon need? Supply lines. And this is going to hinder him. He's going to have to leave troops behind to guard the supply lines. He's going to be depending upon these deliveries for supplies for his troops. They're going to be attacked by the Russians as they come. And then there's a battle at Borodino. Saying that Napoleon was defeated might be a bit much. Most historians agree that it was a draw, but it was the first time that Napoleon didn't run the other people off the battlefield. They left in the middle of the night, and they left the road to Moscow open, the Russians. And when Napoleon got there, Moscow was in flames. He expected the Tsar to come and negotiate a peace with him, but he never did. He just didn't show up. He left Napoleon's military sit there. What he was doing was waiting out the seasons, waiting for the Russian winter. And the first snowflakes started to fall, and Napoleon decided that they needed to get out of there. He retreated. He turned around and headed back to France. The winter was early, and it was brutal. Napoleon's troops were freezing, starving. Meanwhile, he rode in his carriage and ate 3 meals a day and didn't suffer like his troops. He's going to lose 500,000 men on the Russian campaign between the enemy troops doing hit-and-run attacks on them as they came back, and on the starvation and freezing. There's actually a city called Vilna, where about 20,000 French soldiers were found in mass graves because they died of starvation. They got there, they thought they were going to survive, but they died of either eating too fast or also disease that caught up with them. So Napoleon actually takes off without his soldiers once he gets to a place that's relatively safe. And he's going to rush back to Paris to try and beat the story back, to try and shape the story in his own way, as he typically would try to shape the perception of him. Once he got back, though, the other troops, the other countries in Europe, were ready to gang up on him. His army was just completely decimated. He had hardly any of his forces, so they surrounded him, and he was forced to abdicate or give up his power. When this happened, they decided to exile him to the island of Elba, which was between Italy and his home of Corsica. He was guarded he was allowed to take 2,000 men, interestingly enough, and he was mocked as the Emperor of Elba by the British, who, again, they had ship patrols trying to keep him there at all times. But he's constantly looking for news of what's going on at home, what's going on in France. And it reaches his ears that he would be welcomed back if he came back. When he was thrown out, when he was exiled, they put Louis XVIII on the throne, who was the nephew of King Louis XVI. And France kind of went back the way it was under the monarchy. The economy started to suffer again, and people weren't seeing the gains that they'd hoped to make with the revolution, with the Declaration of Rights of Man and the rights of the people in their living conditions. So it got back to Napoleon that he might be welcomed back. So he escapes in the middle of the night somehow with his men, and they hear of the escape, and the king sends out troops to meet him on the road to kill or arrest Napoleon. And instead of fighting Napoleon, the troops join him. He's going to rule for 100 days. He's going to win some more battles until finally he's defeated at Waterloo in 1814 by the combined British and Prussian forces at Waterloo. Most of it's led by, again, a guy named Wellington. This will be Napoleon's final defeat, and it's a battle that's been analyzed over and over again. If you're interested in the details of the Battle of Waterloo, there's a lot of great videos out there and articles about the battle. Napoleon re-fought this battle in his mind day after day for the rest of his life. He was exiled to St. Helena, which was an island out in the middle of the Pacific, middle of the Atlantic, which took months to get to at that time by boat. So they knew he would never escape, and this is where he died, most likely of stomach cancer. Some people believe that he was poisoned by the British. Eventually, his body was brought back to France, and he's buried in Paris. And this is what his tomb looks like today. Now, Napoleon was kind of a controversial character. He made a lot of changes for the good, though. He created something called the Napoleonic Code, which was a legal system that addressed not only laws, criminal laws, but also civil law. It also even gave the women the right to divorce. Previously, they didn't have that right. If a woman was mistreated by her husband, she could get a divorce. However, if a woman mistreated her husband, like say she cheated on him, as Napoleon's wife had done to him, not only could he divorce her, but she would also serve jail time. So it wasn't exactly equal, but women did have some more rights. He was the first in Europe to have free public education for everyone, and that goes back to where he needed a scholarship in order to get his education, so he's very fortunate. They were going to promote people based on talent. He had people in his regime that were from King Louis's time period, some that were from the time period of the Directory. If anybody had talent, he wanted to take advantage of that and include them. So those are some of the big changes that he made. There is a lot of questions about was he good or bad for France. I'll put a link to a video that's kind of a debate about Napoleon's benefit or detriment to France that you can watch in the links. And I'll be asking you today or this week to evaluate Napoleon as a leader and his contribution that he made to France. And you'll be comparing him with the person we'll talk about in the next lesson, who is Jacques-Louis David. Napoleon wrote his own biography. He wanted to shape the story. So one of the things that he made sure that he did on St. Helena was to have a biographer there to get out the story and shape the memory of him the way he wanted it. So one of the things he was most proud of was the Napoleonic Code that he created.